So welcome everybody to the latest Knowledge Network on Climate Assembly learning call. Today we're delighted to be focusing on the issue of transnational assemblies and thinking about what needs to be done in order that we can achieve robust climate deliberations at that sort of scale. And in order to have that conversation, we'll be drawing on two examples in particular: on the Global Assembly, which had its first iteration last year and running into this year, and the Conference for the Future of Europe, one of the panels of which was focusing on climate change. Before I just introduce both of those in brief, I want to just remind everybody that this is being recorded. If you have any questions or any comments, please put them in the chat. They'll be collated by my colleague Frederick, who'll bring them towards, who'll introduce them towards the end of the session, and also it will be some of the participants may offer replies there. And just want to advertise just before we start about the annual conference that's coming up on the 28th of June, which will give us a chance to think about the future of climate assemblies and also the future work programme of the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies. There's details on the website, and I know that Frederick will be posting some information in the chat as well. So our focus today is very much on two assemblies. The Global Assembly, which is an independently run assembly, which tackled the question about how humanity can address the climate and ecological crisis in a fair and effective way. It brought together 100 people from around the world, 100 randomly selected locations, and then through local sortition processes, ensuring that 100 people had a range of attributes in relation to gender, age, geography, attitudes towards climate change and educational level. And they engaged in 6 blocks of work, including engagement with COP in Glasgow, and presented a People's Declaration for the Sustainable Future of Planet Earth in COP26. And I know that there are further plans for future assembly developments. The Conference on the Future of Europe has taken place over recent months with 4 citizens panels, one of which was on climate change, environment and health, with 200 participants from across Europe in each panel, again with the same attempt to ensure diversity across different social characteristics. What's interesting about this process is it then engaged some of the citizens from those panels engaged with the conference plenary, which brought citizens together with politicians and representatives of European institutions to actually produce the final proposals, of which I think there are 6 major proposals on climate and environment out of 49 across a range of policy issues. As I said, what I'd like to do is to sort of introduce you to a couple of people who are involved in each of those processes. We're going to start just very briefly with the Global Assembly. So I'd like to introduce Yago Bermejo, who's from Deliberativa in Spain, and Claire Mellier. I'm not quite so Yago is a partner in Deliberativa. He's been working on citizen participation for more than 10 years as a facilitator and process designer, and he's been one of the driving forces behind both the Global Assembly, and he does know a lot about the conference for the parties as well. Unfortunately, Yago is at an airport and will have to run for his flight at some point, but hopefully we will get some juicy ideas from him and thoughts from him. Claire Mellier is a researcher and facilitator working in the field of systems change. She's one of the co-founders of the Global Assembly and was part of the facilitation team at Climate UK, and was also an accredited researcher at the French Convention, so has a lot of experience. And what I'd like to start with, because you both are really experienced people working on citizens' assemblies and climate assemblies more generally, is how you feel that this sort of transnational process, actually trying to do climate deliberation on a transnational level, differs from national level. What sort of innovations did you have to introduce to actually ensure good transnational, and of course, significantly translingual deliberation? I don't know which of you would like to start on that. Claire, go for it. You pressed your button first. So.
Well, Yago was going to talk about the innovation from the labs that we did back in the summer of 2021. That's when the innovation started. So maybe Yago can start actually, and then I'll talk about the perspective from the global governance and how that differs from the national and local scale.
Okay, sorry, so my fault. Yago.
I will be happy. I hope that it's not disturbing you, the noise of the airport. Okay, so thank you very much for having me here and having the Global Assembly project. Well, I think I will try to be quick because I know we don't have a lot of time. So I will focus on two innovations. So how to do the random selection of participants and how to deal with multilingual texts during a group meeting. Okay, so as you probably know, well, if you look at the world, maybe the best thing is not, if you want to give every citizen, every person, every human of the world the same rights to participate, maybe looking at the national scale or the national grid is not the best way. No? So we were trying to search for a methodology that gives, in some sense, the same opportunities for everyone, independent from the state where they were living. No? And at that moment, I mean, we had a lot of discussions, I mean, with many people from the team, outside the team. And finally, I think it was Brett who found this database. No, I would like to share the screen because I think this is quite relevant. So there is a database of the gridded population of the world collected by NASA, and it gives you a way to do a random selection of municipalities. Okay, so it's more. So in some cases are municipalities, in some cases are bigger regions or another differentiated administrative level. But you can do a random selection. So you go through them. Imagine if you are in Peking, you will be passing the dices for a long time because there are a lot of people there. So there will be more probabilities to arrive in Peking. But if you go from a county in United States with just 1,000, you will pass just super fast. So the probability will be less. Okay, and after the dices, this is correct, dados, yes. So after doing the random selection, we arrived to these points. But these points allow us to go into those municipalities, to those places, and find one person in each of them. So the point is, okay, we are going to random select points in the map based on this grid population of municipalities, and then we're going to try to find a partner, so someone that we will be working with us to recruit someone there. So that was the first innovation, and it was really interesting. No? The second one was, okay, a deliberative process working with different languages in the same room has never been conducted in a way that, I mean, you have several weekends and you are building work. It's layers of work, no? And these layers of work is text, no? It's you start with post-its and then you create a document, and then, so you need to work with text. It's very difficult to conduct deliberation without text. So we were wondering, I mean, how to do this? And in the labs, we were doing this kind of research, so try let's see how we can deal with multiple language in real time in one room. And we find a very easy solution just with the spreadsheet, the Google spreadsheet, no? Because you have this formula. I don't know, you can read the formula, but there is one formula, it says Google Translate. So it goes from the spreadsheet to the Google Translate. So you can write whatever you want. For example, we can write Graham is cute. And you will get it in all languages here. So you can allow everyone in the room to read this and to check that this is more or less correct. What the note taker is which kind of notes the note taker is having, and it's easier to agree on content and to and to solidify the process. And even though it was also used in the Conference on the Future of Europe, it was an innovation that could be used in both projects at the same time. And also we arrived to do this kind of experiments with the labs. That it was amazing, and this was not done in the conference on the future of Europe, because we didn't have note takers. But as you see, we were just copy pasting the post-it from a spreadsheet to Miro, and then we were like separating and connecting all the post-its, saying the same thing, so people could be working in a board in parallel with their own language. If someone moves something in Cebuano, it will be moved in the English board. So it's a way to be working with a board in different languages at the same time. So as you can see here, this was really working in practice. So every participant in the lab was moving things and was helping to clusterize content, for example. So that will be the second innovation. And I think I will give the floor now to Claire. No, this is one of the.
Can I just ask you? Maybe Claire can also jump in on this one. This is amazing kind of use of open source technology. Do you feel that you would say that it allows something which we understand as deliberation to happen?
Yes. Sorry. Yes, Claire.
Well, these are tools, and they just need to be seen as tools. They're not they're a means to an end. And what we found out when we started the process, it didn't come up during the labs as much, but when the process started, it was actually a distraction, the Miros, from actually the deliberation. And so we stopped sharing, in real time, the Miro board with the participants, and it was the note taker who were in charge of it. So I think it's important to remember that the most important is actually, especially on Zoom, allowing the assembly members to actually see each other's face and reactions, rather than focusing on the tool itself. So
so then how were they? Given you had all this multilingual, group, how were they actually doing deliberation aside from, how were they actually understanding? Was it through the Google Doc translation?
So the assembly members were supported, each assembly member was supported by a community host, which is what Yago mentioned earlier. So the community host actually recruited the assembly members, and then they provided the support, technological support and translation. And they were the ones who were showing to the assembly members the output from the Miro boards. And note takers, we had so many roles in the Global Assembly. We had facilitators, but we also had note takers who were there solely for the purpose of recording what was being discussed. So that's how it works.
So it's one of the key learnings here about just the degree of support that you need to put in place in order for this to happen. Because, I mean, obviously the amount of investment that happens within a national or a local assembly is high, but this looks like, this is very resource intensive in terms of if you want to make this happen.
Well, it is resource intensive, but the total budget was only $975,000. So it was less than $1 million. And what was critical for us is that the assembly members were paid the same amount. So in total, they got $600 for their involvement. And so it doesn't have to be expensive. I think what's important, because these are, as you said, tools that are available easily. So it didn't actually cost a lot of money.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that the importance here, though, is the amount of work that went into creating the infrastructure for this.
Exactly, and that's And Yago and Susan Lee were absolutely critical in that.
Yeah. No, I can see that.
Sorry, I will switch to my mobile phone. So I will leave here. Okay.
That's okay. I'll talk to Claire, and if you make a reappearance, that will be lovely. So Claire, I said that in a sense that this is an independent organization, Global Assembly. It's unlike other assemblies where they've been commissioned by a particular sponsor, by a public authority. So I'm kind of interested in how you feel that relationship with, because you were very much focused on affecting COP, I think, if I'm fair to say. There was a strong interest there. How did that work? What kind of reaction did you get from global institutions who, let's be honest, aren't used to seeing this kind of thing? I mean, we don't think national governments and local governments necessarily know much about it, but global governance, you know, this is really new.
Absolutely. So we started from the assessment that global governance doesn't have one single global authority. That's not how it works. And the organizations that actually have power, specifically to address the climate and ecological crisis, it's the UN COP process is actually a mechanism, it's a channel, but it's not the commissioning body. You know, you could think about the global governance ecosystem as the Wild West. I mean, you've got so many institutions, the IMF, the World Trade Organization. So we thought about the Global Assembly as actually one node into the ecosystem. And we saw COP26 as a hook to start engaging these organizations in a conversation about how could citizens input into the global governance agenda. So that was critical, and for us, when it was initiated, we always had in mind that it was like almost a triple track of engaging civil society, social climate movements in parallel with the funders, because the funding came from various philanthropic organizations and the Scottish government, but also engaging these institutions. So we had engagement with the Scottish government, the COP26 unit, Alok Sharma, and as the process evolved, we created actually interest, and although the mandate didn't come from an institution, we then managed to see institution responding, and we had Alok Sharma speaking at the launch event in October 2021, and Antonio Guterres provided his endorsement as well in October. It was really striking to see how his common agenda strategy, for instance, was. You could read between the lines that, you know, is one of his key, I suppose, demand is that citizens are more involved in decision making. So just to answer quickly your question in terms of mandate, it's not the usual commissioning body mandate. Our theory of change was much more about the mandate coming from multiple, tracks, including civil society.
Well, that's really interesting. I'll just a quick question before we move on, and it's a kind of odd question, not an odd question. It's really interesting. What was the thing that struck you most about undoing this? But when you look back at it, what is it that is most striking for you, Claire?
Well,
apart from how much time it took.
Yes, I suppose the learning, we've got a team of 30 researchers from all around the world who have had access to all the data, and our Azucena is one of them, and we'll get lots of feedback from that and learning. But for me, the most striking is how the retention of the Assembly members. We only had 100 this year, it was a prototype, and but we ended up with 99 Assembly members by the end of it, after 68 hours of deliberation across multiple time zones and 41 languages. And so, you know, it's in a way, it's a proof in itself that the engagement was high. And for me, that was the most surprising, I would say. I was expecting a much higher dropout.
It just really gives you an indication of the desire for the willingness of people to actually do this sort of thing, which is really interesting. Yago, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
So for you, what was most striking for you in the process? What's the thing that you've taken away from the process?
For me, is the completely different sample of profiles that you get when you go to the global population, no? Because we are used to work, I'm based in Spain. We used to work in Spain, in Europe, and there is a huge difference. No? We live in a bubble here in Europe. No? So when you go out, you see the diversity of languages. If you go to a really randomly selected process, it's not finding, because sometimes for global processes, you just get, you know, the high cultural profiles of every country. You know? The ones who speak French, the ones who speak English, the ones who know some kind of European language, sadly. But when you go to the streets, to the little villages, you find people that even if it's a French-speaking country, they don't speak French, or they don't speak English. It's happened in Africa, in India, in other places. So finally, the number of languages increase a lot. So you want to include those persons. You need people talking languages that could be not international languages. So this is really important, and also this is correlated with the income level of participants. No, we are used to some kind of standards of living that are completely different at global level. No, we will be like people driving cars and flying in planes is around 15% of the population of the world. So most of the people are not traveling through the world in planes. They don't own a car. They don't. They could be having just a motorbike like that. No, so trying to focus on that, it blows your mind. No, it's okay. This is a different setting, completely different setting.
Thanks, Yago. And I should say we can't spotlight Yago because he's on his phone at the moment. So we've just got it. We've just got his disembodied voice, but he is still with us. Okay, that's really interesting, and I want to come back to some of this, but come back to some of the thoughts about where we go with this. But first of all, I'd just like to introduce a couple of additional people who were involved in the conference on the citizen panels on climate change, on the conference on the future of Europe. And they are Judith Ferrando, who's co-director of the French organization Mission Publiques, who's been working with citizen participation for over 20 years. And she was the main moderator for the citizen panel on climate change and environment during the conference. And I'd also like to welcome Bjørn Bedsted, who's involved in the Knowledge Network management group, but he's Deputy Director of the Danish Board of Technology. He's worked on citizen participation for more than 20 years. He's been involved in several transnational processes, including, he likes to remind us, the worldwide views, which has happened a couple of times, which had a very different format, but was the first attempt to do these global deliberations around climate change. So I want to make sure that we do remember that there was something that went ahead of that. So I'd like to ask a similar question of both of you about, and obviously you use some of the innovations from the Global Assembly, but do you recognize the kinds of stories that we've heard from Claire and from Yago about what it takes to do transnational deliberation around climate? And were there other things that you actually introduced in the conference? Were there more innovations that you introduced in order to enable deliberation across national and linguistic boundaries? Judith, do you want to offer some thoughts?
Yes, I can try. Thank you. Hello, everybody. And Bjørn, you will, of course, have other really interesting things to say about it, because it was also one of the colleagues of Bjørn, Mark, that done the co-moderation with me for this panel. So the first, to answer to question, Graham, there is a lot of points in common between the two processes. And of course, the climate assemblies is part of the continuity of the legacy of other mini Publiques. And so, of course, there is a lot of similarities into the methodology. Non-expert citizens discussing for a relatively long time a topic of general interest, receiving information, more or less information, and producing recommendation to feed into public choices. This is the common basis, of course, of climate assembly. And another thing is that there is a common conviction between the Global Assembly and the first experience of the world reviews, like the world reviews about the COP21, led by the Danish Board of Technology and Mission Publique, the common conviction is that for global topic, we need to have a global discussion, a global dialogue with citizens, because these kind of topics are really too serious to be left only to experts and policymakers. This is a common conviction. And I guess that the framing of the Global Assembly, as you say, is how can humanity address the climate and the ecological crisis in a fair and effective way, works also for the panel of the Conference of the Future of Europe. It is the same kind of framing, not in the word, but in the spirit, if I may say. But this is for the common points, and all other common points is the challenge of the multilingualism, because it's really difficult to maintain, to keep a living discussion when we don't have the same language. So of course, there is a lot of innovation, as you show, Yago, with the Google Sheet that we have also used, thanks to Yago, into the Conference of the Future of Europe, into the panels. But it's not really easy, as you say, that sometimes it disturbs the attention, the focus of citizens. And for the Conference of the Future of Europe, we have had a lot of interpreters provided by the European institutions. So it was really useful for multilingualists, but it's not a sober solution, if I may say. It's really an expensive solution. And I think that one challenge for us to develop, to increase transnational dialogue is to find a new way to have a living discussion with different language. Because if we use only written tool or part of written tool, you lose something like about feeling, about non-rational, non-verbal activities and communication. And it is also a part of deliberation to be able to share emotions, feeling, and so on. So it is a common challenge. But about the difference, the Global Assembly is a bottom-up process, and the panels of the Conference of the Future of Europe are top-down design. Of course, even if the agenda, the internal agenda, if I may say, into the panels were also chosen by citizens. They have large topics, you know, for this panel, climate, environment, and health, but after they select themselves what kind of topics, what kind of problem we have to solve. It is another kind of agenda setting, if I may say, more constrained, of course, by the design, but also a kind of agenda topic setting, sorry. And for the two cases, for me, the main challenge is the same. I'm sorry, I know that I don't answer exactly to innovation, but because after I will talk to the main innovation for me, it is the plenary. It is the main innovation for me. But for the rest, I think that in the two cases, the challenge is the same, is how to strongly influence decision, because the recommendations are really great in the two processes, the recommendation made by citizens, but how this recommendation can support, can push for the main changes that we need to have in our economical system. And for me, it is the main difficulties that we have now is to be able to influence policy making and stakeholders. And this is the first thing. And after, I know that you have another question about the measure put in place to promote political uptake. And this is for me the best innovative way into this process is to have put in place the plenary, but perhaps I can talk about it after. I don't know if
no, sure. Well, maybe Bjørn can also bring in some thoughts and maybe talk about the plenary as well, which is this question of the interesting thing that is brought in here, and again it differs from worldwide views, which was again a sort of you know, in some ways was more like the Global Assembly in its kind of in its ethos. But Bjørn, I know that this was a top-down process that moved from panels into this plenary where citizens were suddenly working with politicians and with officials from different European institutions. That's not our usual mode of operation. So how did that work from your perspective?
With difficulty, I would say. I mean, I don't know what you say, Judith, but I think it would be fair to say that this is not really our innovation. That to a large extent it is the innovation of the three institutions. So this is also where it differs from both the.
Sorry, Bjørn, for those non-European watchers, because there are people who don't know the details of the European Union. When you say the three institutions, what do you mean?
The Council, which is the gathering of the individual member states, and to a large extent has the biggest power. Then the European Parliament, where you have elections, and then the Commission, where member states appoint commissioners, and they have the legal initiative, the initiative to make legislation. And this is where this differs from both the Global Assembly and from Worldwide Views, which you also mentions, which was more or less, you know, initiated by people like us that want to bring this into policy making. This came, the European panels, the coffee process came from policy making. So, I mean, they left a lot of the panel design, the European panels, to us, to the method experts, but entering into plenary and these working groups, we lost a lot of control, and a lot of interactions were going on the terms of the three institutions. So it was more like citizens stepping from a context that we more or less controlled into a context where we had very little control and was not organized, you know, in any way, in a way that method experts in citizen participation would organize it. But they did remarkably well, the citizens.
And just a couple of comments on that from looking from the outside is that this was designed on the foot, you know, very quickly, as in, you know, you didn't necessarily know what was going to happen in the next week. So it's, you know, that some of this is was very rapid. And the other thing about the plenary, so for those that don't understand, is some of the citizens who are in the panels were then working directly with politicians and representatives of the institutions. And what I remember seeing a tweet from somebody, and I think Yago may have shared it, of the citizens were the ones who stayed for the whole conversations, and the politicians often walked out. And actually, you know, about how seriously the citizens were actually taking this plenary process was really quite exceptional. And it's really interesting that this is one of those rare occasions where we actually see a link between the mini public kind of activity and the kind of the established institutions of power. So Judith, have you any views about how that works?
Yes, and I stay really humble. As you say, Bjørn, it is not our innovation, but it is something that happened and that worked in his own legs, if I may say, during this conference. But just to explain it, we know that one of the limitations of the citizen deliberative processes is that they operate in silos. Most of the time, the citizen did a really huge job with making good recommendation, and after they give their recommendation to policymakers, and the policymakers examine them and come back with explaining how it changed or not the final decision. But the final cut is, of course, from the to the decision maker. So what happened into the plenary of the Future of Europe is absolutely not perfect, but it is a way to enrich the dialogue between the citizen recommendation and stakeholders and members of parliament, European Parliament and national parliament. So what happened is that each panel, each of the four transnational panels, send 20 ambassadors to the plenary, and we have to figure out that the panel spent 3 weekends each, and the work into the plenary conference, it was 7 weekends, 2 in 22 and 5 in 23 between January and the end of April. So it is a long time dedicated to this kind of dialogue in order to improve the recommendation and to transform the recommendation of citizens to final proposition given to the 3 European institutions. So it's not perfect because, of course, there is a lot of power game into this plenary. But what was really interesting for me is to see how it works not into the plenary session, because plenary session, it is like a show, you know, it is an arena, it is really agonistic, as we know. But what was really interesting is what happened in working group, in the smallest working group between the different multi-stakeholders, because into this working group, the only basis of discussion was the citizen recommendation. So the agenda was really made by citizens. And after the discussion and the disagreement between the different people into the room have to be argumentated. And it was really interesting. It was, how to say that, it was like a revealing of the power game between the different national member of parliament or European member of parliament. So it was really interesting to open, you know, the black box of the decision and to show how a political decision happens. Sometimes it is great, sometimes it is really a pity, but it is in an open space. The citizen realize how it works. So it was really interesting for me as a political momentum. And it was interesting. And the second really interesting thing is that the citizen also understand the game of the rules of the game by losing some party, and they made a strong pressure on some on some stakeholders and decision makers. And for the case of the recommendation of climate, environment, and health, I found that at the end, the final proposal, led by all the stakeholders, are quite better, more ambitious. It's not the case, not always the case for the other panel, but my opinion is that it works very well for this recommendation. So for me, it is interesting, not perfect, and we lose a large control on it. Us as a deliberation team, the practitioner, we have few control, but it was really interesting to see. Not perfect, but really interesting to dedicate the same time or most of time to have this kind of dialogue and not to work only with perfect citizens. Because citizens are always perfect, but not the decision makers.
No, it's really interesting. And I think actually, you know, having that moment where we've actually seen randomly selected citizens working with these kind of with political elites is in itself really, really novel and really interesting. Now, I had loads of questions I wanted to ask you, but we're you know, we've been way too ambitious with this call, a bit like maybe some of the projects. So I'm going to ask each of you to respond to a single question, which is, what do you think's next? Where do you think we're going to go next with this kind of developments? And Bjørn, I'm going to start with you, because you're the one who you've been involved in Worldwide Views, you were involved in the Global Assembly, and you were involved in Conference on the Future of Europe. So what next? Where do you see the next move for transnational climate deliberation?
I mean, we're going to find out, but from what I understood from May 9th, which was the final event for coffee, and correct me if I'm wrong, Judith, but the way I heard von der Leyen, she said that one of the things they would do in the future was to make some kind of cross-European citizen panel every time there was a major legislative initiative. Now, that idea, we didn't know until the end whether whether or not she would include that in the speech. But from what I understand, it's an idea coming actually from the Common Secretariat. So whether or not that will take effect is to be seen. But there's a good chance that something will happen, and I'm very curious to see what.
And Judith, where do you think the next event? Where do you think this is going?
What is planned is what you say, Bjørn, and there is two other things that one is planned is to have a follow-up session in the fall, perhaps in November, with all the citizens embedded into the transnational panel to explain them the final decision taken by the three institutions, so European Commission, Parliament, and the Council, and to make something of a kind of accountability about what they produced. So it is one of the promise, and it will be held, I hope. And the second thing is that perhaps they will have a convention on the treaty changes. And if it happens, I know that some of part of the Common Secretariat, that is the Secretariat dedicated to this conference with the member of the three institutions, and some of them would like to involve citizens into the discussion about the changes, the change of the treaty. So it could be also a thing. But if you ask me in my dream, what could be the next, it's not the same answer, of course, because for me, the next frontier for us is also to be able to build deliberative process, not only for citizens, but also for politicians and for stakeholders. Because for me, as I say, the plenary was a great experience, a first step, but for me, it was not a good deliberative process. And if we want to really change the way of decision taking, we have to transform also the kind of dialogue that the stakeholders and the politicians can have together. So for me, it is the next frontier.
Okay, and Claire, bringing you back in, what do you think is what's next? What do you think the next step needs to be in terms of? Well, obviously, there's a next step for Global Assembly, but what do you see as the next move in this area?
Well, there's the Summit for the Future that the United Nations will hold in 2023, and it's I think it's becoming obvious that Antonio Guterres is supporting citizens' deliberation. So I think for me that's where potentially the concept of the Global Assembly becoming institutionalized could really become a reality. But linked to what Judith was saying earlier, I think for this to happen, in my opinion, we need a movement that will support the awareness and the translation into reality, because at the moment as Judith says, we've got processes that lead to recommendations that are not always taken forward, and there's with the Global Assembly, one of our theory of change aspect was that change won't happen unless there's pressure put on the decision makers to change. And so for me, what's going to be critical in the coming years is actually create that movement building and change the narrative around deliberation, so that it's not seen as an exception, but needs to become the common trend. And I do think we need to build on what the younger generation is actually saying, and that's, for me, that was obvious when I heard Suzanne, one of the team member of the Global Assembly, she's 20, and we had Flynn as well, was 22. For them, it's common sense. So we need to build on that, I think, and create this movement.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Maybe those of us who are older and sort of immediately go, well, you can't possibly do that. You can't, so, and actually there is that kind of because of how the kind of technology and the kind of ways of thinking that we've grown up with. That's really interesting.
The UN Next Generation Fellows actually have the Global Assembly as a recommendation. So it was not taken in the Common Agenda Strategy, but it was actually in the Young Generation Fellows reports that informed the Secretary General strategy.
Yago, did you want to throw in any thought just very quickly, because we're behind the schedule about what's next?
Yeah, so I believe we are living we're going to live an acceleration of this kind of process, because I think we are in a tipping point of technology. We are seeing now the transcripts in Zoom happening in English, but I mean, it's just a few months maybe, or a few years, to have those transcripts in English translated into every language. So we could be speaking with subtitles like in a film. So I feel that it's gonna reduce a lot the expense. I mean the resources needed to deliver this kind of processes. So I think they're gonna be increased, and I think also global deliberation has more sense in a multipolar world than it is in where we are going. Not just a unipolar world, but also having countries like China, where elections are not really accepted by deliberation, could be more connected with their culture. So finally, this could be a agreed methodology for all people for global issues. So that's it.
Okay, that's really great, Yago. And I realize you're going to have to disappear now. We've actually invited 3 respondents to come in who in different ways have been engaged with these processes and to share their thoughts and questions. We have a little bit of shall I say, activity going on in the chat between a couple of people, and I would really appreciate it if you took that to some other place. I think it's distracting some people from the from this discussion. Azucena I'd like to introduce first. She's a research associate at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, and her work explores the interface between social and political philosophy, democratic theory, and citizen participation. And she was one of the researchers, a part of the Global Assembly research team. And so, Azucena, tell us about your experience, maybe about some of your findings, and also, do you have any questions that you'd like to raise for the panel?
Yes, thank you, Graham. Let me know if my internet at some point stops working. So this is perhaps is going to be a difficult question. I also don't have an answer to it, but I would really love to hear your comments on it. So while we were evaluating the Global Assembly, and I'll say this is like very preliminary, we have seen somewhat a particular distribution between the time that was spent learning about the ecological crisis and climate change, etc., and the actual deliberations. And this was translated also in like facilitators, we're not only in charge of enabling deliberation, but also supporting the learning process among participants. And I see this somehow like as an active response to the unequal distribution of knowledge and political and climate knowledge across communities, and also the complexity of deliberating globally and using colonial languages. But I think that it also somehow sheds a light on the challenge of moving from learning to deliberation, and from the discussions about the learning journey and the actual deliberation. So I was wondering whether you could talk to me a little bit about the learnings and failures that came from the Global Assembly, in terms of how do we move from this learning stage to actual deliberation of responses to the ecological crisis, and somehow what did we learn about this, like moving from learning to deliberation, and what things could be done differently in the future Global Assembly to support this transition from learning to deliberating.
Yeah, well, I think can't wait to see your research output, because that's something we were very aware of when we designed the learning phase. It was very content heavy, and we were not sure how to find the balance between bringing people with such varied level of understanding, you know, to a place where they could actually deliberate meaningfully. So that's why the information booklet that was informed by the Knowledge and Wisdom Committee, which had indigenous knowledge, wisdom keepers, but also scientists and experts in multiple fields, they informed the design of that booklet, and that was used as the basis for the learning. So that was very text heavy. And there was an intention when we designed the learning phase to have actually different ways for people to engage with data and evidence. And I think that's for me, that's one of the failure and the main learning is how can you bring different modes of relating to this. So using more interactive tools like videos and audio recordings and things like that are not just based on text. So that's one thing. But what we tried to do is actually use the assembly members' lived experience as actually a way to inform the deliberation. So we had witnesses, some of the assembly members volunteered to be witness and share their experience, which informed the learning. But I do think that deliberation, and I think that will be interesting in terms of the qualitative index, deliberative qualitative index. I think that's what's being used in Canberra. The quality of the deliberation, I think, could have been stronger if we had allowed more time actually for the deliberation and less on the learning. But I would say that's probably the biggest learning for me in terms of these prototyping year, is how to do it more creatively for the years to come. I don't know if it's answering your question, Susanna, but
did you have anything else you wanted to add about that, Susanna? What are your thoughts on that?
It's a really tricky one. Yeah, I also thought about in similar lines to Claire, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see the learnings coming from this first Global Assembly turn into the second Global Assembly, and I'm really looking forward to that. I also thought about separating the two moments. So kind of like, you know, making not only in terms of like what kind of tools are being used to learn and then to deliberate, but also it's kind of like a physical, you know, like separation of moments in between, almost as if they were different phases and not they weren't interlinking between each other. So, you know, how can we actually separate the learning and the deliberations so that there's like a clear distinction, and also like a clear role from citizens coming in and saying, okay, I'm not here to learn, but actually to, you know, like to stand in a different place and say, you know, this is how we're going to create an idea together. This is, you know, how I change my mind, and this is how you can, I would like you to change your mind. So I think that would be, that is really interesting in terms of experimenting with very, you know, different global knowledge inequalities and different languages in terms of the future Global Assembly.
I think that what you were just saying there about inequalities is really in terms of you know, sort of educational levels and all sorts of different things, and knowledge levels is really accentuated when you get to the Global Assembly. It's something which we probably haven't experienced as much within some of the European assemblies we've done. So that's really important. As you said, thanks for your contribution. I'd like to bring in next Laura Gallant. She's Network and Delivery Manager at Democratic Society. She's leading the official team, evaluation team for the conference on the future of Europe. And Laura, do you want to share some thoughts and potentially questions, particularly aimed at Judith and Bjørn?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Graham. And also thanks everybody for your viewpoints and perspectives so far. So indeed, I was leading the evaluation team from the inception of the conference until the end of it in May. And I think my biggest takeaways from what we have observed so far is that indeed, the conference has shown us that transnational assemblies do provide an incredible potential for when it comes to finding common ground across points of view of citizens across countries, especially when it comes to specific priorities around climate. So for example, we could see that a citizen from Romania may find that they have common priorities with a citizen from Germany. And in terms of their socioeconomic backgrounds and in terms of also their geopolitical backgrounds, this exchange proved to be quite valuable because we could experience where some of their priorities aligned, even if they were from different countries. So from a transnational assembly point of view, this was absolutely valuable and a great learning opportunity. What I think is also an important aspect that we also noticed while also evaluating the conference is that sometimes we saw how citizens constructed a lot of very constructive ideas around climate proposals, but sometimes they probably lacked some of those, some of the knowledge around what constitutes a European competence as opposed to a national competence. So we basically observed how sometimes they would have certain assumptions as to how and what they would propose regarding certain proposals, like for example, protecting water sources and combating river and ocean pollution, or support reforestation and afforestation. These are all very valuable proposals, but sometimes probably they weren't very sure as to to what extent the European institutions could really come in and bridge some of those and really uptake some of these proposals. So this has a lot of consequences as well for the extent that there is an impact on political uptake on these different proposals. So this was one thing. And the second thing was, of course, during the plenaries, which we touched upon, citizens probably lacked initially the knowledge of how to actually interact in such a politically heavy setting, especially when they didn't know what sort of situation they were going to be confronted by, and also in terms of the sort of deliberation setting that there was in this plenary. As Judith rightly mentioned beforehand, it could have been a lot more deliberative there, but of course, in a plenary setting, it's very difficult to find that sort of deliberative balance there when you have so many different political entities and so many different perspectives being brought up. So mainly, yeah, if I had to ask a question to the organizers, what do you think, seeing the proposals on climate change and the environment that came out of the conference? What would you do differently next time to ensure that there was a bit of a better uptake of knowledge on European versus national competences before these deliberations took place? And to what extent, and what would you, and also in terms of what they expect upon entering a plenary setting? So these are my main 2 points. Thank you.
Bjørn, can I start with you with those? Do you want to pick up on either of those two?
Yeah, I mean, about the competence and so on, we had discussions about that in the beginning. My own opinion about that is that citizens shouldn't be confused about that, because then they would enter in developing, recommendations on certain areas, and then being told the EU doesn't have competence. They would stop, go in another direction, and maybe someone will come and tell them, no, the EU doesn't have competence, stop. So it would be a hindrance. But regardless of that, even I would also say that this is the future of Europe, so it's not the future of the EU. And the process now is that each of the institutions, that includes the Council, has their own process for how are they going to deal with the results. So I would say that recommendations that fall within national competences should be dealt with by the Council. So I actually think that makes sense. Do I continue about the plenary or pass on?
If you've got a quick thing to say, Bjørn.
Yeah. I mean, yes. I mean, they sure lacked citizens' knowledge about how does such a plenary session work. But we fought, for getting space, for introducing them to this, and Mission Publique did a good job here also in trying to put them up to speed, you know, with the limited time and resources we had. A curious thing is that, you know, to a large degree, the rules were not even defined. So, I mean, even though some rules exist, of course, around such a plenary session, and it's a natural habitat for policymakers, but actually what happened during the process was that the rules were negotiated and changed. And a lot of it was not actually thanks to us or the institutions. It was thanks to the citizens that fought for keeping the recommendations from the panels at the center of the plenary process. And that wasn't given from the beginnings. And in many ways, it's absolutely crazy that this battle landed in the hands of the citizens, in the working groups, in plenary, but they took up the battle. So that's to me a very interesting learning point.
It's very interesting.
Your observation is absolutely valid. Yeah.
It's very interesting that perhaps it's because they'd been through that deliberative process that they had such commitment to doing that. I mean, that almost certainly that's the case. Judith, do you have anything to add to what Bjørn said at all?
Yes, I agree with Bjørn. In this kind of process, we have to avoid to make a mimetism between citizen and experts. So of course, sometimes they have a confusion about the competences of Europe, but it's not a problem. It doesn't matter, if I may say, because at the end they are authorized to dream to other competencies for the European institution or for the different level of action. So it was interesting not to make it in the box of the treaty of today. So it was interesting, even if sometimes they lose time. But for me, if we have to streamline this kind of deliberative process and to optimize, if I may say, the time of the citizens to make strong recommendation, what I think that we have to do, but I have the same opinion, you know, for the French Convention on Climate, is that we don't have, we have to help citizens to understand the main challenges of today, and not to have a long, a long knowledge on climate change, but what are the limitations of today? What are the controversies? And what kind of positions they can take on it? For me, we have to help them to focus on the big issues, because the risk is that they reinvent all that already exists into the Green Deal, for instance. And this is for me the main problem that we have had, and we have all of times this kind of problem into the deliberative framing, because the organizers are not ready to accept to to put on the table the most hot points, hot issues, if I may say. That is the point. And the second one is about something really interesting that happened into the working group, is that when we arrived at the plenary on, I don't know, February or March, the citizens, the ambassador from the panel on climate, environment and health say, okay, we have done a good job with other citizens into this panel, but now is it always the good recommendation with the war in Ukraine? So they put on the table that they have a big doubt on it, and they were really humble. What we can do to protect our sovereignty and in the same times to tackle climate change. So it was a really good discussion, and they make the finger on the right things to discuss into the working group. It was really a learning moment for me.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Judith, and thank you for your question, Laura. We have one other invited commentator, who is Susanna Karp. Susanna is a climate policy campaigner in Brussels for over a decade. She's led advocacy campaigns for several international NGOs. and has recently started doing freelance work advising EU institutions and NGOs around climate governance. She's been active in the democratic space. She's an elected board member of European Alternative for over half a decade, and has also been involved in organising an assembly on environmental rights within Romania. Susanna, it's a real pleasure to invite you into the space. Any comments you want to add? Any questions that you would like to raise?
Hello, hi everyone. Thank you so much for sharing some extremely inspirational examples and stories that you've experienced or heard about or studied. And I have to say, this assembly has opened my eyes in many ways. And I'm really, really glad to have taken part in it. Indeed, I have been involved as part of European Alternatives in both the Citizens Takeover Coalition, which started in 2020 when the Conference on the Future of Europe was postponed. And then it followed this conference until the very end. But I was also involved with organizing citizens' assemblies around environmental topics. So I will ask a question and comment a bit on what I've heard today from this perspective. What we've tried to do very much with the conference on with the Citizens Takeover Coalition, which in a way predated, let's say, the conference, but also ran in parallel to it, was to actually increase, let's say, the representativity of citizens who got to debate on European topics, and then with a view to finding a way to actually connect the conversations. So the Assemblies of Solidarity were actually organized all around Europe, and not, let's say, in places where the European institutions were. And we've then written many letters and tried to bring forward the declarations that emerged from some of these assemblies, and then to find a way to actually connect the dots. Now, the reason why we did that, and this is where I'm going to actually try to expand on everything I've heard today, is because we think that typical methodologies for citizens' deliberations and citizens' assemblies are extremely useful and also developing still. And we'd like to bring to this development the question of how do we actually make sure that they're not, once the assembly is formed, it doesn't then become very inner focused. And how do we ensure that it actually keeps a link to the citizens who are not in those groups? So what I mean by that is when we talk about climate change, which of course is the most cross-cutting topic that humanity will ever have to deal with, it is extremely important that the same way we have this gap between learning and deliberation, that then we seek to minimize, let's say, or to extend a leg of the bridge between deliberation and then confronting, let's say, citizens who didn't take part in that deliberation, not with a view to confronting them, you know, in a negative way, but rather to engage with them. And so we are very curious in exploring methodologies and ways in which that can be done, whether it's by opening up the assemblies at some point to have external input, whether it's by going on the streets and actually creating a link to, let's say, the real world, or whether that's by inviting cultural expressions and a way to actually relate to the everyday, let's say, experience of citizens who don't take part in the citizens' discussions, but who will nonetheless be part of the climate transition. So this is a big question. How can we, and maybe it doesn't need to be exactly at the same point in time, but maybe it can actually foresee, so a citizen assembly formed can actually foresee an element of it as a linkage to the world outside and bringing back some of that feedback. So how, that's basically the question. Judith, Bjørn, and Claire, how can that be actually built into the assemblies, and do you see a value in doing so? Many thanks.
I'm going to go to Claire because I actually think first, because I think the Global Assembly did actually do some really interesting work here of trying to also do, I don't know what you called it. Was it called community assemblies at the same time, Claire? And I thought that was a really interesting innovation. Do you want to just tell, and maybe you have other things you want to say, but I think that's a really interesting that you thought of that as a core part of your project.
Yeah, absolutely. So we always, the way we describe the Global Assembly is in three elements, three channels: the core assembly of 100, the community assemblies, which could be initiated by anyone, using the resources from the core assembly, and then the cultural wave. And the community assemblies were, the thinking behind it was exactly to address your raising of allowing people who couldn't be part of, you know, the deliberation to still engage. And so that's, for us, that's going to be a huge learning, because we were hoping we would get more community assemblies. So how do you support participation? There was the intention, but actually in terms of the uptake, it's not as high as we were hoping. In terms of the cultural wave, I think that's what's really coming through is we've had artists engaging with the assembly, and so at the moment, for instance, we're working with Asif Kapadia, the documentary maker who made the Senna and Amy Winehouse documentary, and he's really interested in how you bring a process like this into the wider world. So how do you document it? And we know that the Climate Assembly UK, the French Convention, had documentaries made about them that were quite impactful. But when you talk about the global scale, how can you do that in a way that's meaningful? And so we had the cultural wave as well, where artists could actually submit their art, and that will come through in the coming month. We're receiving the input now.
That's really interesting, actually, that actually as part of the design of the assembly that you weren't just focused on the 100 citizens, but actually you thought there had to be community dialogues around it, that there had to be artistic engagement with it. That's
I mean, the light bulb moment for me was when I was observing the Convention Citoyenne, where the assembly members at the point of voting said, we're not going to put forward some of our measures to referendum because we don't believe that the rest of the population will understand why we've come up with these proposals, and they held back from actually putting some of their measures. And it was, for me, okay, well, you need to bring along people on the journey in parallel with the assembly members and create that wider engagement, really.
No, that's really interesting. Now, Judith and Bjørn, I've got a feeling that one of your responses you're going to say is that you were rushing to do this process. This is a process that was designed by that was being commissioned by the European institutions, and it was enough to actually get it to happen. But I guess my question is, fitting in with what Susanna was saying, if you could design it such that there were opportunities for wider engagement, what would that look like? Because the danger is the Conference on the Future of Europe is yet another process which most citizens don't know anything about. So do you have thoughts about how you could, what could have happened around it? Judith, do you have any thoughts around that?
Yes, during the Conference of Future of Europe, the link with the macro public was made by the platform. So it was the promise or the illusion that the platform can create this kind of relationship between all the citizens of the Europe and this process. And of course, it doesn't work. There is some contributions, some events. Of course, it's not nothing, but it's absolutely not the promise to have this link and to involve the public. So what could happen? I really don't know, because perhaps if the citizen, the participant have had more times in between two sessions, perhaps they can have some activities in their own countries to have open discussion and really horizontal discussion with other citizens, because we know that to increase the awareness on climate change, the question is not information, is the deliberation, the discussion support the awareness, because when you discuss, it's another cognitive way to be fed by information, not a passive way, but an active way. And we know that it is one of the best impact in our deliberative approach. So we have to invent some side activity for citizens to be themselves a part of the dissemination of this awareness. But it takes time, and into this process, there is no room for that. But in other process, we have had a local convention on climate and biodiversity in the suburb of Paris just soon, and it was one of part of the work. The citizen have time dedicated in between two sessions in the intersession time to meet or to gather other citizens, really popular citizens, to discuss about it and to raise the point of view, the visions, the fears for the futures. But it is a big, for me, it is a big problem, because if you come back to the classic of the political science literature on deliberative democracy, there is two impacts. One is to feed the policy decision, and we know that it is difficult, but to try to do it. It is part of our job as practitioners. But the second goal is to enrich the quality of the debate, the public debate. I don't know if it is the right way in English, the right word, sorry. But we absolutely forgot this part, to have a kind of popular education on it. So it is a part of our job, and we have to be able to do it. I don't know how we have to be humble, Susanna, but it is really an important thing that we have to do.
Thanks, Judith. I would like to carry on this conversation. I think it's really interesting, and I'm going to have to leave Bjørn to one side. But thanks, Susanna, for that really interesting pushing us into thinking about how we think of these processes within a broader participatory ecosystem. I think it's absolutely critical. So thank you for that. We try to do too much. We've tried to do way too much on this call. I found it absolutely fascinating, and there have been some comments in the chat. And I'm just going to bring in Frederick, whether there is anything. Whether there is anything you feel that hasn't been, things that have been commented on that haven't been captured, and anything that you feel we should get some last comments from the presenters on.
Yeah, sure. I think there are a couple of questions that could be interesting to just address quickly. So one thing is just a quick one. There was a question around how many communities assemblies the Global Assembly had. So that's one thing. But another more elaborate question is from Julian, who says that mini publics generally consist of small groups. So in that sense, they're exclusive. So they are a small sample of a large population. And in these transnational assemblies, even more so. So you have an even larger population, right, trying to make a mini public out of it. So the question is where there's awareness amongst the participants in these transnational assemblies that they are some kind of representatives, or that they represent an elite or a small group. And if they try to think or act on behalf of the excluded social groups, and if you think that there are any ways to make them think around this.
Okay. There's also been a bunch of questions in there which I just want to recognise from Nicholas, and particularly interested in this idea of having the idea of tying these in with the idea of global referendum. And obviously, and I'm just kind of interested in thoughts around whether or not we could imagine that possibility, or particularly perhaps more at European level, or whether that's just it is so far away from where we think practice is at the moment. So you've got your choice of things that you'd like to pick up, and I guess also maybe the thought of, if there's one thing we take home from us about these processes, what should it be? So Judith, can I start with you? Do you have any views about, in response to those questions that were raised at all?
I would like to let the floor to Bjørn, because I talk a lot. So
okay. So Bjørn likes other people talking a lot, so that's fine. But I guess it's interesting, that question about in particular that question about whether or not you think you captured the voices of the excluded in the or whether you felt that their positions were being represented within the European within these sort of these large scale consultations?
I'll evade that question and answer the question as to whether they were aware of this. The citizens, I think they were. So they discussed a lot between themselves. Are we representative? Are we not? Are we here on behalf of ourselves? Are we not? And when the ambassadors went to the plenary to represent the other citizens, there was a lot of discussion between them, and mutual nudging, saying that we are here to represent the recommendations coming from the others. We are not here to act on our own. I would also maybe mention that we did have some discussions actually about how you could imagine an interaction between what was going on in the transnational assemblies and the digital platform. And here you can easily imagine, some kind of back and forth in terms of a broader inclusion. The problem with the platform is you don't know who's there. So you don't know how representative that inclusion would be, but that's an opportunity. So there's, when you think of the link to the broader public, there's the awareness part and there's the inclusion part. So the inclusion part, you have to be careful about curating, who else gets a say in a process and how big is it, considering how representative that group of people you give a say is. But there's certainly something to work with here methodologically, and awareness-wise in terms of linking up to the broader society. I think also NGOs, stakeholder organizations, collaborating with those would make a lot of sense. And as Judith said, political impact is a good way of increasing attention, and so is a good communication strategy, and enough funding to execute it. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that. Claire, do you have any last thoughts? So there was a very specific question about the community assemblies. I know you would like to have seen more, but how many did you actually manage?
I thought Yago raised his hand. So
is Yago still here? I didn't realize he was still here. Sorry.
But I saw a hand raised.
So I'm in a Ryanair, so let me delay.
Oh yeah, you're in Ryanair. It's never gonna leave, my friend. So do you just have any? We've only got a couple of minutes. So do you have any thoughts you want to throw in?
Some notes. No, they told me that they have to hear me, so I cannot talk anymore. Sorry.
Oh, okay, no worries. Nice. It was nice to see you. So Claire, it's back to you.
Well, it might be a bit controversial, but I'm going to speak about the elephant in the room, which is how these processes are rooted in Western rich deliberative ideals, and how I think that's something we're grappling with the Global Assembly. How do you face, as commissioning, as practitioners, how do you face your own values and beliefs and the colonial, and I think we have, this is not comfortable, but I think we have to do a lot of work around that, is reflecting on this, and it links to, I think, the point Judith was raising about who sets the agenda, and the Club of Rome, for instance, has started, promoting citizens' assemblies as a model for addressing transformative economics, so post-growth, degrowth models, etc. I think that will be really important to monitor what's going on in this field, because at the moment the commissioning bodies of these processes are power holders who are not interested in actually bringing these conversations, I think. And again, I think the Convention Citoyenne was interesting in that respect, because the Assembly members raised the issue of GDP and being a main blocker of change at the very start of the process without having heard about it from experts. So I think there is an interest from citizens, but whether this is going to be taken forward in these deliberative processes, I think for me that's a really critical question.
No, I think the question that the issue you started your response with, in terms of thinking about this as what does this set of practices, which has really come from Anglo-American kind of ways of thinking about deliberation. What does that mean on a global scale is really incredibly pertinent, and I think that might be another call. I think that the questions around what does deliberation mean in a global context. But listen, this has been as ever on this call we've tried to do way too much, but I hope we've introduced people to some of the processes and issues that have been faced both within the Global Assembly and the Conference for the Future of Europe, and actually from that we can begin to think about where we can take this work on transnational climate engagement and deliberation forward. I'd like to thank everybody who's participated, for Azucena, Laura and Susanna, who asked such interesting questions, but mostly I'd like to thank Yago, Claire, Judith and Bjørn for being so willing to share their learning with us. This has been a really interesting call, and I hope you will share my appreciation for the time and thought that they've put into their presentations and their responses. And it's been a real pleasure to engage with you thinking about the transnational aspect of climate deliberation. So thank you again, and have a good afternoon, evening, morning, or whatever time it is where you're phoning in from. So thanks everybody. Take care.